It has been over a year since the armed conflict between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces began in April 2023. The conflict has had a devastating impact on the civilian population and caused the largest international displacement crisis in the world, with over 7 million Sudanese fleeing to other areas within the country and over 2 million people seeking safety abroad. Welcome to Security in Context. I'm Anita Fuentes, and today we are joined by Khalid Mustafa Medani, Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University. Khalid is in Cairo right now, where the peace talks are taking place, and will walk us through the key turning points that have shaped the conflict, the role of social movements in the peace process, and the impact of regional and international actors on the ongoing crisis. Hello, Khalid. How are things over there?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. And I always begin these kind of interviews or discussions with thanking you for your attention to Sudan. It's not always one that is covered the most by mainstream media and even other forms of media. So I'm very grateful for you including and giving attention to Sudan, especially at this time.
Well, I think we should be paying more attention to many causes around the world. So no need to thank me for this. Thank you for dedicating your time to also teaching us things that maybe the media is not covering, and so we're not exposed to. Let's start with a broader and more context-oriented question, because I think, as you were saying, many people are no longer talking about this. The conflict in Sudan has been described in many different ways. Some have called it a proxy war, others have called it a counter revolutionary struggle, some have called it a civil war. So, could you walk us through the key turning points that have shaped the conflict? And can you help us better understand the current situation from a contextual perspective?
Absolutely. I thank you for beginning with that question. There's always a confusion about the dynamics of the war, its origins, how to define it. Part of the confusion is that not only in Sudan, but throughout Africa and other parts of the world, of course, beginning in the 1990s, especially, you had a kind of a cascade of civil wars, which I think makes it very difficult to define what this particular war is in Sudan. People reference it as a civil war or as a proxy war. I would define it as a counter-revolutionary war, and I would define it differently from the kind of civil wars that Sudan has experienced since independence in 1956. Sudan has witnessed a number of different civil wars and insurgencies in Darfur in the west, of course, South Sudan that seceded from Sudan in 2011. But this is different. And I think your viewers and listeners, I think it's very important for them to understand it's a counter-revolutionary war. And the way to walk us through it is to begin from the beginning, so to speak, and that is 1989, when democratically elected government was voted in after a long period of military rule in Sudan. And in the summer of 1989, the critical juncture that led to this war occurred. And that was the assumption to power of an Islamist backed military regime led by General Muhammad Omar Bashir at the time, who was later ousted. But for 30 years following this coup, a number of different policies were implemented that built what we call, of course, in the Middle East region in particular, the deep state. And in this context, it was really an Islamist run deep state, the first and only one in the Sunni Arab world. And the way that the Islamists did it at the time in the 1980s and very much, of course, in the 1990s and all the way to 2019 was to establish a policy that they called actually empowerment, to empower themselves. And this policy had three different pillars that those not familiar with Sudan should really understand. The first one was, of course, to build a very strong loyalty and constituency to buttress their autocratic regime. And the way they did that was to dismiss upwards of 800,000 civil servants from their jobs. And in addition to that, of course, banning all forms of labor union organization, professional syndicate organizations, any kind of opposition in civil society, professional syndicates, as well as labor unions that would somehow in the future overthrow them and wage a revolution. That was an important pillar. They replaced those civil servants with Islamist loyalists to make sure that they gave the benefit to their loyalists and also to generate commitment from them. The other very important pillar was to take control of the domestic economy. And that required a great deal of use of force to generate wealth from the extraction of minerals, whether it's oil or gold, but also high level corruption, where in Sudan it was became almost impossible to do business if you did not cooperate with the Islamist regime. And of course, they also dominated the Islamic banking and financial services. And the third and perhaps most important pillar I think people should understand is to coup proof any kind of attempts to overthrow the regime. And the way they did that very ominously and dangerously was to weaken the National Standing Army by basically creating a multitude, or not a multitude, but several militias. The most important one was the Janjaweed militia that they utilized as a proxy counterinsurgency force in Darfur in the early 2000s. And that then becomes later the Rapid Support Forces, the militia that is fighting the present army. So what they did is they set a legacy, if I was to summarize, of a deep state that was dominated by them in terms of its economy, a deep state that was dominated by them at the level of bureaucracy, and most importantly, a deep state dominated by Islamists through their support of militias. And that becomes a really important aspect of the history. If I was to link these policies to this war, I would say that 30 years on, from 1989 to 2018, finally, the Sudanese people rose up, and this is why it's very important to identify this as a counter-revolutionary force. The reason the war was sparked was because of the sheer success, I need to repeat this several times, the sheer success and mass mobilization of millions of Sudanese in late 2018. Following, of course, many iterations of popular protest, beginning in 2011, following the Egyptian Arab uprising and the uprising in Tunisia, Sudanese begin to mobilize in the same way as their Arab neighbors, particularly youth, of course. That begins in 2011. It goes on to from 2011, 2013, all the way up to 2018, when finally there's a critical mass of millions mobilizing that managed to overthrow this very, very autocratic and very kind of coercive regime. That revolution was so successful that it laid the groundwork for the present war in a couple of ways. One of them is that, of course, the leaders of the National Congress Party, the Islamist one, a party that took over power in 1989, were intent on doing everything to preserve their power and undermine this revolution. On the other side, you had the militia who had very much the same agenda. The militia that they spawned, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who fought in Darfur and put down protests of young people during the revolution. They had, so to speak, a shared agenda at that time. And that was to basically upgrade authoritarianism or reform the authoritarian regime by including some civil society leaders. In 2019, there was this hybrid regime of civilian leaders and military leaders, and it was a compromise that, of course, was very, very fragile because the veto power in terms of laws, but also most importantly, the military power was with the military side. And after 30 years of repression, civil society was relatively weak. And of course, through that process, there was also the repression and killing of young people, the revolutionaries that protest. So that becomes important. The protests continue because it's very important to emphasize how revolutionary this moment was in Sudan, more than even its neighboring countries. Young people in their millions continue to protest daily. They're unsatisfied with this partnership. They refused to give legitimacy to a partnership that did not offer them full civilian democracy. And because of these protests, what occurred finally is that the generals, General Abdel Fattah Burhan, along with his then partner, Hemeti, who's now the head of the militia, decided on October 2021 that they would wage a military coup and completely upend any efforts at revolution. And here is where you really begin to see the catalyst for the present war. Following that military coup, you'd think that everything would be settled, but the revolution continued. And I want people to understand that every day, young people continue to protest throughout the country, basically rejecting this military coup, forcing, believe it or not, the military to actually come back to the table with their partner of the militia leader Hamdan Dagalo under international auspices, the United States and Saudi Arabia in particular, but also the EU, and that is to work out a framework agreement that they worked out. By December 2022, a little bit before the war, you had two contentious issues that really lead to this horrible war that you described at the beginning of your program. And these contentious issues was one of them was around merging the militia into the standing army to have a legitimate standing army that represented the people rather than the forces of the militia and the coercive apparatus. That is a professionalized army that would do away with these militias that had, kind of led to so much violence in Darfur and in Khartoum and throughout the country. There was a big disagreement. The army wanted it to occur over the course of a couple of years, and the head of the militia naturally wanted it to occur over a 10-year period. That was the first contentious issue. The other one was actually discussions over anti-corruption and dismantling the deep state that I described. That, of course, would undermine the economic and power interest of the Islamist dominated National Congress Party. At the same time, it would also undermine the economic interest of the militias themselves. But those two contention points lead to divisions between the militia leaders and the militia and the top brass of the military, dominated by the Islamist movement and former members of the National Congress Party in Sudan. And so in April 2023, things come to a head because of these two contentious issues, and shots are fired. Most likely, we now know it was actually provoked by Islamist faction within the military who thought that they could quickly achieve an ultimate victory. But of course, they were wrong, because for 30 years, they themselves had created what we'd call, frankly, Amy, the monster of the militia. That is, of course, devastating Sudan. And so it is at that juncture that we can explain this counter-revolutionary war that is not like a civil war, not like a proxy war, not like a peasant revolt, and not like the Arab intifadas that we've seen even in other regions in the Arab world. I hope that was a little bit clear.
Right. Yeah. And I actually want to talk a little bit more about the Sudanese uprising and the mass protests that, started in 2018, 2019, and that captured, global attention. And as you mentioned, were so important, right? And achieved so many victories, even though there's been a lot of repression. So where are these social movements now? And what role have these social movements played in efforts to resolve the conflict?
Well, that's a really important point, because thank you for emphasizing, because actually most people think that they've disappeared because of the force of the war. And so that there's somehow a complete victory of the two parties. First of all, we know there's a military stalemate. Where they are is that they're in Sudan. They continue to be. They've transformed in general from what they called resistance committees, that is, committees that were waging the revolution, organizing the protest on a daily level, and of course, allying with the labor unions and professional syndicates in order to wage that very large mass mobilization that leads to the revolution. In the context of this present war, they've transformed themselves in what, in some instances, they call emergency response rooms. They've decided that for the time being, of course, it's very important to do whatever they can in order to to enable people to survive. So they're collecting donations, supplying healthcare to people, supplying food to people, organizing soup kitchens. That's in Sudan. Outside Sudan, many members of these resistance committees, these grassroots organizations, continue to fundraise. We're doing a fundraiser for them in just next week out in Canada, where many of them are. And so there's real mobilization. But here, it's mobilizing around really the sheer survival of Sudanese that are in need. That becomes important. But they always remind me, and thank you for asking the question, that they have a draft of a transition called the People's Charter, the People's Revolutionary Charter. And that was one that was worked out before the war. And in that charter, and you can easily Google it, you will find that they have a couple of things. One of them is an analysis of the historical legacies, colonial and post-colonial, that have led to this moment. the lack of democracy, the lack of liberation and freedom. And in that document, following that preamble, they have kind of itemized the most important things that need to be done with respect to a transition to a full civilian democracy and the liberation, so to speak, of the Sudanese people after so many decades of military rule and violence. And that document was worked out through consensus. I want to emphasize, in terms of the social movements, one of the reasons they were so massive in Sudan is that every region in Sudan of the of all of the states in the country have what we call a resistance committee. And those came together over many months through consensus to draft this charter. And this charter basically is a blueprint that many people don't talk about, because we're going to talk about the Geneva talks and the negotiations, but people forget that the real legitimacy is actually with the people in Sudan. And there's a charter that was written, and it's available and continues to be what Sudanese activists call the ongoing revolution. And that charter goes through what the kind of parliament should look like, representation should look like, how the women and youth must be represented in the transitional period before elections. It goes through security sector reform. Just in a nutshell, it demands that the military go to the barracks. In Arabic, it sounds a little bit more poetic, and that the militias, all militias, have to be dissolved. And those are the two. If I was to leave you with where the social movement are, they continue to have these demands: no recognition for a military civilian partnership, no legitimacy for them, and most importantly, the military has to be professionalized. They should get out of politics, go into the barracks like most armies, and all armies should, and militias have to be dissolved, either integrated into the army or dissolved completely through security sector reform. So there's a plan out there ongoing that is part and parcel of the vision of the revolution following the war. And I just want to be clear about that.
So let's move on to what the media are talking about the most now. How significant is, in your view, the Sudanese army's decision to send a delegation to Cairo for peace talks, especially given their refusal to engage in discussions in Geneva? And what does this shift indicate about the current dynamics of the war, the conflict?
Well, at the very basic kind of principled position of it it really represents the kind of the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground, for people who don't follow Sudan daily as like we do, is that there's essentially a military stalemate. It was on both sides, but particularly I would say the kind of top brass of the military. It was their expectation, believe it or not, because they have the Air Force under their command, that they would actually execute and prosecute a war, and it would end in their victory sooner rather than later. That has not happened. So the facts on the ground really are the reason why you have negotiations in the first place, and why the two parties have decided to negotiate in some form. Remember, this begins in May of 2023 in Jeddah, where the two parties sent delegations, both the military and the militia, to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to speak to the Americans and Saudi Arabians. This is the latest iteration. Following that, there was another one hosted by IGAD, the regional bloc of East Africa, another one hosted by the African Union, yet another one after that hosted by Bahrain. What happened, and what we were saying, is that everyone was working at cross purposes. The reason for that is the different regional blocs and countries in the region have different economic and strategic interest in Sudan. And so the biggest problem has been when you don't have a coherent kind of effort internationally to negotiate and end wars like the ones in Sudan. You allow loopholes for the different actors to basically manipulate the international system and the negotiations. And that was what's been happening from the beginning. The Geneva talks represented something new in one particular way, and that is that it brought these conflicting interests together for the first time. It's very important for your viewers to understand that, unlike the other talks, this one brought all of the different regional and important regional blocs and actors. It brought Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, even Qatar. It brought the African Union, the United Nations, all around the table. For the Sudan armed forces, of course, for the militia, the rapid support forces, they immediately said yes because they're striving for legitimacy and they need, as a militia, to have international legitimacy. That's from their perspective. From the perspective of the international observers and mediators, they want to secure delivery of humanitarian aid. Much of the Darfur, for example, is under the control of the rapid support forces, and that's their agenda. For the Sudan armed forces, they refused to go to Geneva for two very important reasons. One of them is the United Arab Emirates is part and parcel as an observer of these talks, and they have accused the United Arab Emirates repeatedly of financing and sending arms to the rapid support forces. They feel that, to put it bluntly, the United Arab Emirates is their enemy. And they refuse to sit down with that. That's the number one kind of problem. Another one is they insist that there shouldn't be a new format for the talks because the international community, the Americans in particular, and Saudi Arabians, should commit to the Jeddah Declaration that was signed signed in last year in 2023. There were a couple of Jeddah declarations, but in essence, the most important thing to focus on here is what they're saying is that we want the international community to force the rapid support forces to leave the residence and the homes of Sudanese occupied by the rapid support forces. They want them to leave before they negotiate, and they want the international community to insist on that. But I would argue that it really is fundamentally their desire to maintain power, and they feel they'll be weakened if they go to these talks. Now, because of that, the U.S. envoy decided to compromise with them and decide that he would meet with them separately with the Egyptians and the Saudis in Cairo. The problem with that is, as the news just came out. I can understand where it's difficult to follow, but that meeting has not materialized. The U.S. envoy got on a plane and went back to Geneva. The Egyptians said because of protocol reasons, we've canceled it. And the real reason for the cancellation, or they're calling it a delay in the talks in Cairo, is because there was a huge dispute over the composition of the Sudanese delegation coming from the army side. And that the contention around that is that the U.S. envoy and the Saudi Arabians wanted to talk primarily to the armed forces, the military men, in order to make any kind of agreement on the protection of civilians and delivery of aid to make it implementable. They wanted the main kind of protagonist in the war to be at the table, but not civilians, so to speak. The Basically, the military is essentially captured by the Islamist. Burhan himself has tried to, in some instances, become more independent, but their power right now over the military is so immense that they have been pulling the strings with respect to this decision making over these negotiations. They decided to send a delegation that included the Minister of Mining, who is an associate of the Islamist movement, and the partisans of the Islamist movement, and they decided to send military intelligence personnel who are part and parcel and central to the former members of the National Congress Party, and the military intelligence is dominated by the members of the former regime and the Islamist movement. That was rejected by the U.S. envoy, who went to Geneva and just today said that we will not accept, or rather the Sudanese people will not accept the rapid support forces to have a political role in Sudan's future, nor will we accept members of the Islamist movement to come back to power. And that just goes to show you the opposition that he and the Saudi Arabians have to the return of the Islamist movement, and of course the majority of Sudanese do as well. So right now we have a so-called delay because of this kind of contentious issue. But in a nutshell, really, if I was to say what is behind the delay is really the refusal of the National Congress Party, that is dominating the top military brass, the refusal of for them to really understand that they have to give up power in order to have a transition that would lead to peace in the country. And they're doing everything in their power to influence the military in ways that would perpetuate the war. And safeguard them staying in power. It really is as simple as that. The militia leader, of course, has his interests, but those are very clear in many ways. He's interested in expanding his power, and most importantly, he's interested in maintaining his vast empire, financial empire that is generated from gold, livestock trade. So his interests are really financial. I would say the Islamists in the army, their interests are both financial and political. They want to return their former party that was overthrown by millions of Sudanese through a revolution by hook or by crook. They want to reinstall it as the most powerful party in the country.
Um, and I think to expand on what you were already mentioning about the involvement of neighboring countries in the conflict, I want to talk about these, actors as well as the international community, because the international community has been criticized for its inadequate response to the crisis in Sudan, particularly after famine was declared in at least one part of the Darfur region. So, given the scale of the humanitarian disaster and the urgent need for aid, what role do you think the international community and also neighboring countries should play in ending the conflict and preventing further damage?
Well, thank you so much for that question. When people say the Sudan is a forgotten war, I'm sure you've seen that in the headlines. I would, I know this sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but I would say, unfortunately, it's not a forgotten war. By that, I mean that the sustaining of the war and its expansion and the counter-revolutionary forces begin very early on. This is a country that borders 7 different countries, a country that is the third largest exporter of gold in the African continent, a country that borders the Red Sea, one of the most important strategic waterways and trade routes in the entire globe, that, of course, as you know, is at the very center of current tensions in the Middle East and elsewhere. It's a country that has vast lands, agricultural lands, and one of the largest exporters of livestock to the Middle East countries, particularly the Gulf countries. You have a constellation of interest. Russia, of course, as you know, has a history there, and they continue to negotiate with the army. The Wagner Group had been very active in Sudan. So it's not forgotten by those actors who are strategically interested in Sudan. And they, if you put it all together, have done two things. One of them is that many of them, a number of them, played a counter-revolutionary role in kind of upending the revolution. They very much lean towards the side of the military and rather than the revolutionary young people in terms of overseeing a transition. I'm speaking particularly of the Gulf countries who are, as you know, or people in the Middle East know, are always very anxious about another Arab country, particularly one so close that has a democratic civilian, government, and that is well known throughout the region and outside of the region. And so there was not sufficient support for a civilian democracy. That becomes really important. The other thing is the strategic and economic interest. Very quickly, just for people who are not aware, 90% of the gold that is traded in Sudan is smuggled informally, and that most of it goes to the markets in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. Some of it goes as far afield as Russia. But in 2022, the last time people took figures or they were able to, that amounted to about over $2 billion. You can imagine the amount of wealth that not only, of course, goes to the Gulf, to the United Arab Emirates, but particularly to the head of the Rapid Support Forces militia, who's able to basically fund and pay his mercenary soldiers. That is one story. The other very important one is the conflict over the Red Sea, where you have the United States in competition with Russia and China. And of course, Qatar is interested. And right now, the Russians are negotiating a naval base on the Sudanese Port Sea. And that, of course, pits America and Russia and Iran against each other. Iran is supplying drones to the Sudan armed forces. So not to confuse everyone, but just to highlight that all of these constellation of interest make Sudan important enough to have actors intervene in ways that are perpetuating the war. And that is very important. So that has to be understood for me to ask you to answer your question more directly. What can the international community do? Well, they can do no harm. That policy is important. They can either play a negative role, and I would argue that is what has been happening, or they can play a positive role. My feeling, and this is just to put it out there, we'll see, is that the severity of the war has expanded to such an extent that it has or is undermining the interest of countries that prior to this would have been at odds with each other. Iran and Russia continue to be, of course, at odds with the US, but we have competition within the Gulf countries themselves in the Middle East, competition between United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And so the Geneva talks have kind of demonstrated or shown something new, that the war in Sudan, unfortunately, is so severe and is spilling over throughout its borders in such a way that there is now kind of a growing realization that it's perhaps crucial for there to be coordination by the countries most adversely affected by the war in Sudan. So we'll see that, but I feel that that is where the momentum of these talks is really coming from. Of course, hopefully, most of it is coming from uh, you know, saving Sudanese lives, but we're talking in your program about security issues. But the other aspect, of course, is the security context of the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea region, and of course that for is very much it borders Libya, where there is, as you know, much great deal of instability. So the larger security context has gotten to such has undermined and threatened so many different countries in the region. This is not a forgotten war. This is a war that is at the very heart of the conflict now in the Middle East and the Sahel region. And here is where we have to take it seriously and follow these negotiations, because the momentum of the negotiations is really the United States interested in safeguarding their interest, not only in the Sahel, but particularly in the Red Sea region, where you have a great deal of conflict. It is Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both of whom have strategic interest in Sudan, but also vast financial interest, not only in minerals, but land. And of course, Egypt, which is such a central country to Sudan with respect to the refugee issues in Egypt, but also the security issues along the Red Sea, and Egypt's rivalry with Ethiopia over the Nile Dam. So I'm not to complicate things, but it's very important to understand the larger security context that helps us answer that question of when the international community causes harm, and when it actually can play a more positive role.
So before we wrap up, I always like to ask, if there's anything you'd like to add, maybe some sort of conclusion, maybe something positive, if possible.
Well, I'm always asked about where the hope comes from and what's positive, and I kind of answer that after many years of working with young people. I think that the young people represent the largest segment of the population. That's the same in Africa. You'll see protests now in Kenya, Nigeria. It's not only young people in the Arab world who protest, and I think that we are seeing a sea change that's generational. And the hope and the positive aspect is the young people and their insistence on continuing the objectives of the revolution that they began so many years ago, really. And so, despite the brutality of the war, one of the problems, of course, understandably, the media needs to focus and wants to focus on the warring parties. There is much less focus on what is happening among youth on the ground, how they're keeping the momentum and organization of their movements, not only inside but outside of Sudan. After all, it's their future, their country, and they're insisting on a transition to a civilian democracy. Why do I mention that? They have actually impressed upon the Americans and the U.S. envoy, over correspondence, over meetings, that they continue to insist that the majority of Sudanese, the vast majority, insist on a transition to a full civilian democracy. And you will hear the U.S. envoy repeating that and reiterating that in every interview. That comes from the momentum of the revolution and the lobbying and pressure of the young people who are insisting that we will not actually give any attention or legitimacy to a different option than the option that we began with in late 2018. And that is a very strong, powerful force. Justice is not something to just feel that disappears. Those calls for justice, and especially in the context of such a brutal war with now 10 million displaced, the option can only be return to civilian rule. So, as an older person, I have to say that, because you have to have a sense of history about how these kind of things eventually turn out.
Well, Khalid Mustafa Medani, thank you so much for joining me today. And it's been very enlightening to speak to you, and I hope we speak again soon, maybe with better news than now.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor, and I'm delighted to that I had a chance to speak about Sudan. And also, let me commend you on all the work that you do. I've already followed some of your programming, so that's a lot of hope there too. So, thank you.